Thank you very much. Good evening. First, I want to say that I feel very privileged to be hosted by the National Library of Israel from two reasons. One, it's the basic one. This is my second home. You know, this is the front of research in Israel, and I wrote my PhD there. It's like a place that it's like really like a second home for, and always a great place. And the second thing that we are using the National Library a lot for all the exhibitions and the sources, and it's a unique place in Israel. It's always very helping and very great attitude for helping researchers. So it's always a privilege to work with them. I wish all the archives and libraries would be like this. I just want to correct one thing. I mean, the exhibition, I see a mistake here, I curated a permanent exhibition in part of the new upgraded Tower David Museum. It's like the Museum of History of Jerusalem, and it's one of the gallery is dedicated to Jerusalem and photography. It's a permanent exhibition. I'm the curator. I thought I will speak about it very soon. A few other exhibitions which we dealt with the history of photography, and the opening was this week. So it's the whole new upgraded museum. It's something that happened like once in 30, 40 years. So we are all very excited about that. So as you see, I called it Eye to Zion. You know, Zion is one of the name of Jerusalem. Photographing Jerusalem, women and men photograph Jerusalem from 1839 to the 70s. There is a mistake here. So here you can see the Tower of David, the museum, which by himself, it's kind of a museum. My background, just to say a few words, is I started as a photographer. I studied photography. I exhibited as an artist a lot, like 30 solo exhibition, numerous group exhibitions. But I was also writing a lot about India, and then I did my PhD in Indian studies. So there is no any connection to photography, but the fact of doing PhD and doing research gave me the ability to combine two fields that I mostly like. It's like photography and research, and this gave me the ability to curate. So it's like in this kind of thing, I have kind of two hats, like as a curator, as an Indian studies researcher, but I'm dealing a lot with the Jewish encounter with India, and so in this way, it's much connected to Zionism, to the two national movement, and etc. So it's also relevant here. But this is another aspect. So here you can see just that my focus on Jerusalem and photography, it's based on the idea that in some respect, photography or Jerusalem, it's unique case in the photography and the photography history. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it, but when we will see, it's because of the attitude to Jerusalem and the variety of communities that live in Jerusalem. It's different from two main aspects. One is what we call the Orientalist photographer who came in the 19th century from abroad, and what is very much well known as the Zionist photography. Let's say the photographer who put themselves in the front of helping Zionism and photographing the modernity, the pioneers, and so on. And Jerusalem was much more complicated. And in 1960, in 2016, I curated the exhibition, as you can see here on the left, the cameraman, and it was actually the first attempt to check who were the local photographers in Israel, not the photographer who came from abroad, but the local one. And I wrote biographies of them about them, and it was really a great project. So this gave me actually the base. The other one, the Mount, which dealt with the most sensitive, let's say, place in the Middle East, and it was a photography exhibition. It's viewing Temple Mount, so it was focus of the history of photography of this unique place and how it became, let's say, the explosive barrel of the Middle East, as we can see all the time in the news. So here you can see down the two catalogs, which luckily or not luckily enough, they were all sold out very quickly, but you can download them from my academia page because I got permission from the museum because they are out of print and it's very difficult to get copies of them. And for this exhibition, and this you can see how it's going to be, I try to summarize the last two of, there were other exhibitions as well, but the other exhibition, and to try to have a broad picture about photographing of Jerusalem. So what I will do in this presentation, I will divide it to several chapters, how I divided it in the exhibition, and we give some example. I'm sure I won't be able to go through all the material, but some I might skip more quickly, and some I will try to emphasize some points that have relevance to today and for photography. I won't speak about so much about you know, the photograph themselves in terms of black and white, shadows, spaces, you know, subject like, it's like more on the political social aspect of photographing Jerusalem. So as you can see here, I divided it to several chapters. So first one is the Orientalist. I don't like so much this word, but of course the early photographers. It's a very well-known subject, maybe the most researched one in the whole history of photography, about this huge wave of photographer going to the East, whatever it means, the East, you know, from India to North Africa, but we can say anything that it's not Europe except the New World, like, and this is it's a very important part in the development of photography in general. Then the very interesting aspect of the Armenian photography, which has a kind of long, small, from the mid 19th century, the American Colony Photo Department, which is maybe one of the most important photography institution, and left us a huge documentation of the Orient. The fourth one will be Khalil Raad and Arab Palestinian photography. This is a bit more sensitive, and maybe not everybody will agree with what I'm going to say, but Khalil Raad was considered to be the first Arab Palestinian photographer. Number 5 will be between tradition and change, which I mean the Jewish community of Jerusalem, between conservative, religious, to the newcomers, the Zionists, the modern, and how they dealt with it. So Jerusalem was in kind of between tradition and change. And I remind you that the attitude to Jerusalem, the Zionist movement, was a bit more complicated as we will come. And I'm not going to show all the Jewish photographers, but 2 examples, Sadok Bassan, which was Orthodox Jew, and Yaakov Bendov, the pioneer of photography and a pioneer of cinema in Israel, which every photo for him had to serve the Zionist mission. Another chapter, which is also could be in a question mark, is the first women photographers. I think deserve it, but it's of course until the mid 2030s, until the German Jews started to come from escape Germany, it was a very much male-dominated field, and the 7 would be photography as art. I'm not going to show modern photography of Jerusalem, but when photography was eventually, and it happened later than in the States and Europe, as a form of art, and like not just documentation and a profession. And the 2 projects that I'm going to show, they were done in Jerusalem, and they were the milestone in conceptual art, but the only thing that remained from them were the photographs. So, and the last one, if we will have time, it's what is going to be on the wall. It's photographing Jerusalem history, because, you know, photography, it's a modern thing. So it's kind of aspects that used for political, cultural, and social events. So in this part, there are some of the iconic photos of Jerusalem. Some of them, I'm sure you know, some of them maybe less, but what's considered to be the iconic photo, the selection was very difficult because, of course, there are many more. So, you know, Jerusalem in the 19th century was quite a pity place. I mean, we have a lot of evidence of that. And if just to quote Herman Melville, you know, all the Christians pilgrimage that's coming to Jerusalem. So he wrote, no country will more quickly dissipate romantic expectation than Palestine, particularly Jerusalem. To some, the disappointed is heart sickening. And famous traveler and writer, the first not writer, but his famous travel book about visiting Palestine, Mark Twain was more cynically, and he said, visiting the city in 1867, Mark Twain cynically protested that even the most devout of his travel companions could not be moved to shed a tear at the sight of the holy city, which was no long larger than an American village of 4,000 inhabitants. Jerusalem was in the old city, surrounded by the walls, very dirty. People were poor, but there were already the waves of change. A Jewish famous Zionist, Brenner, and a literature critic and a famous writer, was very Zionist. So his attitude to Jerusalem was even worse. He said that the city that only has a place in the Idle East, holy shops in which everything is on display, where sanity is sold by an unk whose only worth has always depended on what others have said about it. And this is a very crucial point, because this is give us already the hint about the ambivalent attitude of the Zionist movement in Jerusalem. Because if we say it on maybe in a simple way, the whole what the Zionist movement tried to do was it was a contrast to what Jerusalem represented at that time, like the Orthodox Jews coming to die or to study there and not being productive and so on. So just this holy, and the Zionist movement also as a secular movement. So I will start to speak about the early photography, which is important aspect, but on the other hand, it's the most well-researched one. I mean, because the main idea behind this is because when the camera was registered as invention in 1839 in Paris, so already a few months after that, there stood a photographer in Jerusalem trying to take photos. So the influx to the east, what we call the Orientalists, whatever, as I said, whatever it means, it's a big part of the development of photography in general, like the history of the global photography, not only the local Middle East, Palestinian, Israel photography or the Orient. It's a huge part. So every institution in the world, every famous important institution in the world has a collection of photos from the Orient, and of course, let's say the Middle East, if it's important to Christianity, was in the focus of that. So, and there is a lot of course, criticism when speaking about Orientalist photography. In the beginning, they were mainly interested in the monuments. They didn't took photos of people, or even if they took portraits, it was some kind of examples, like kind of Orientalist examples to show to the people in Europe. And you can see it very clearly. We skip one thing. You can see it that usually they use the people just as a kind of scale for the monument. Some of them came with Christian ideas, because of the situation and the condition of Palestine at that time was so bad. So it was kind of a proof to the truth of Jesus or Christianity, because, and for example, George Kane, which this is a lithograph, but it's based on a photo, which you see Mount Zion empty, and this is like for the Hebrew paragraph, Zion Sadeh Techaresh, like Zion is with, the plug, I don't know how to translate it, but it's like this famous quote. This is like the proof of the truth of the Christian prophecy. But on the other hand, this I'm also don't I say that in the bottom line there is always a place, a monument that somebody was the first one to photograph him, and you have to give them this credit. So it gave us a lot of information. We can see it how how places were seen. We can learn a lot of places that doesn't exist anymore. So there is a lot of other importance. So I usually like more the early photographer term or the first documenters of the Middle East. So, and many of the photos are the same because they were taken from the same viewpoint. They were taken by the local guides. But on the other hand, we have to be aware that there were at least 300 photographers. Some of them we don't know much. Nissan Peretz, the former curator of photography of the Israeli Museum, did a huge research, but still we are adding a lot of information, and we're getting more and more information about them. And I'm sure there were even more. It was a huge wave. We cannot realize it today, but it was like always photographer, some of them living for a long time. It was a very difficult process. You had to do you have to bring tent and all the chemicals, and sometimes the results were not good. And these photos were published in books. It took time until it could be published as a photograph, or were shown as a lantern, like slides, in the villages or in the churches in Europe and United States. The beginner were French, and you can see here, which again, it's a lithograph, but this is considered to be the first photograph of Jerusalem. Of course, it's from the classical viewpoint from Mount of Olives. And you have to remember that at that time, you could not enter, for example, the Temple Mount. It was not allowed to non-Muslim to enter the Temple Mount. But what is interesting, it was published in 1842, but this lithograph is based on the first daguerreotype, which was taken in 1839, maybe 1840, and this is considered to be the first photograph of Jerusalem. As I said, from the classical viewpoint. And the fact is, as I said, that few months after photography was registered as invention, already a photographer stood in Jerusalem, and there were even some earlier attempts. In the exhibition, I'm preparing a book, which there is no book like this, but kind of a display book, which I selected like what I thought, like the 25 most important photographer, and trying to make some kind of 19th century tour in Jerusalem, how Jerusalem was looked. And it's very interesting because there are many books about the photographing in the Orient, but I don't think there is any book like this. I hope in the future the museum will publish it as a book. So Joseph Philippe Guérin de Frangy, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the French name correctly, he is actually the first photographer, because these we have the daguerreotype, and he's the one that have the credit to photograph so many places in the Middle East, in the Orient, the first one to photograph them. So I will show some example. You can see how the daguerreotype look. Have these blue tents, and there were a negative side, like you see to the negative side. And as I said, this is from the Getty, but there is from the Metropolitan. This is kind of very rare. There is a nice tendency of now big institutions to give free access to this historical material, and I hope other libraries will adopt them as well. So you can see here a few examples. For example, this is, just to make clear, this is probably the first photograph of the Tower of David. This is actually the first photograph of the Tower of David, not museum, but the Tower of David, the citadel in Jerusalem. So I selected few examples because I want to go on. Ugo Zaltzman, for example, very famous one, that he was focusing on archaeological details, and this gave him the ability to make a very special composition. Here you see the triple gate, the closed gate to the temple, or a fountain, our fountain in the old city, and you can see the shades, the black and white, very, very unique at that time. Photograph, because a lot of the Orientalist photographer, as I said, might look the same, more or less. And another monument, a little bit different, but there were a few exceptions. Another one that I want just to say a few words about is like Mendel John Dines, and this is coming to the point, who were the first Jewish photographer, but I'm not sure you can really call him a Jewish. So there is a very interesting story because the teacher in the Papa, James Graham, which was a Christian missionary, living in Jerusalem. He taught Mendel John Dines, a Russian Jew, but he converted to Christianity, and this was a big scandal in Jerusalem. You can see this is probably him in the Western Wall, and this is the guy. And just few years, more than few years already, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, in a garage sale in the United States, somebody bought for, I don't know, several $100 all his, and when some boxes which had all the prints of Mendel John Dines. I said Jewish, and I put it because, you know, now is the tendency to put him as the first Jewish photographer. He was living in Jerusalem. He is coming from Jewish background, but he converted to Christianity. So it's a kind of a big debate about it. It's like, what does it mean that a Jewish photographer? You can see here the Israeli Museum made a catalog, which you can see the very nice catalog of one side, James Graham, his teacher, and Mendel John's photograph, and the student was much better than the teacher. But for example, Mendel John's photograph, which cannot turn a name, like the first building to be outside the wall. So probably also his Jewish background or connection to the Jewish community could help him to photograph. Another one that, just to say a few words, Louis de Klerk, he was the first one to photograph all the stations of Via Dolorosa, and also in a very unique way. Just very unknown or very difficult to find a photo of Albert August Isaac, but he photographed this left side photo of the Western Wall. And there is, you know, I didn't say it in the beginning, but the next exhibition that I'm working on it's about what is the story of the Western Wall. And, you know, when did we start to pray? It's very complicated issue. And this is probably the first photograph to be seen that people are praying. Because I don't know if you're aware of that, but there is all this argument or a big debate. What's going on in the Western Wall today? It's controlled. It's like a synagogue. For clear, it's controlled by the rabbinical authority in Jerusalem. But all the time, let's say liberal people were not left, but we say, oh, but in the past we can see photos of men and women seen together in the Western Wall, and this is true, of course. But and if I will jump 2 slides, you can see like what we call the women of the Western Wall, the Western Wall Women Organization, which is a big issue now in Israel, which they are not allowed to access till the stones themselves. And if they want to do bar mitzvah, joint bar mitzvah, men and women together, so there is always you know, problem and tents and demonstrations and appealing to court and so on. So people use the early photograph of the Western Wall as a proof that at that time men and women were praying there together. It's true, but it's a bit more complicated because it took time to the Western Wall to become synagogue. Most of the time it was a kind of a pilgrimage place where we were just reading psalms, and and that was obviously more mixed one than a prayer. Just to, and I'm not, you know, I'm not in this way justifying it, but there is also a very early photo of 1902, which you can see already a fence. So I think it was question of the possibility, or if it was a prayer or not a prayer, if they were allowed or not allowed, and it's not that simple that before it was like this and now it's like this. Of course, as I said, the Western Wall today is really controlled by the rabbinical, and it seems less as a national place and more as a religious Orthodox place. And this I will deal in the next exhibition or part of it. I will end this part with the Bonfils, and I skipped many, but the famous Bonfils studio from Beirut, which also left us a lot of the documentation. Were very popular. It's very easy to find their materials. Every collectors have them. They published a lot of books. They were kind of the mother and then the 2 brothers, and they were active for a long time. Very, like, they always are considered like the Orientalist photographer, because sometimes they use the same model as one time as a rabbi, for example, photographing him in Beirut, and one time as I don't know, a seller in the market, and it's doing the same person. Yeah, so here you can see how they would develop films at that time in the American colony, and I want to move to the what I call the local photography. So as I said, the local photo, Jerusalem offered a more challenging place. If I would say it in a very simple way, Tel Aviv was founded later, but Tel Aviv was the Hebrew Zionist city. So in this way, many photographers who were photograph the same things, like the secular, sport, cultural see. In Jerusalem, what was unique, that each photographer was actually attached to some community or some group. So we have a much wider variety of that. On the other hand, and also there were a lot of tourists, so they had to sell this kind of Orientalist photograph. But the local photography, in a way, really developed during the visit of the German Caesar, second German Caesar William II, not this William II in 1898. And, you know, symbolically also, this was the time when Herzl made the effort and came to Palestine, his famous visit, in order to approach Zionism. So we can see it very clearly, even there were some already Jewish settlers in Palestine earlier from the Baron Rothschild, but we can see it very clearly as a turning point. First, the visit was a huge success, very well documented all over Europe. Until today, there are a lot of materials about this visit, again, using photography. So it's kind of starting the photographing historical events. And here you can see Herzl in the center. And this is also, we can symbolically call it like the entering of Zionism to Palestine, and the country is going to change its face. So in a way, I consider it the start of local photography, although there were the Armenians that were much earlier. And Jerusalem, as I said, was a big challenge to it was a challenge to the Zionist authority, because one hand, it was the historical justification. On the other hand, as I said, this is all what they really want to change. And this way, Tel Aviv, or like the pioneer settlements, they were the one that the photography were focused on them. If there was a Zionist album, so they would send a photographer to photograph a woman on a horse, a Jewish guard, working in the fields, making wine in Rishon LeZion, and they will put one photo from the Western Wall or the Temple Mount, someone as historical justification. So, and the photographer in Jerusalem had to deal with this aspect. So back to the Armenian photography, which is a very unique story. This small community, this is actually the really first local photography. This guy, the Sai Garbedian, who later became the Armenian Patriarch, he came as a student, as a monk to the Armenian Patriarch in Jerusalem, and established the first local studio in Jerusalem, and it was working for several years. And most of the Armenian and many other it was small, but few other later important photographers were actually studying in the Armenian studio. It's very difficult to find materials. He later became the Patriarch, and then he stopped to work as a photographer. Now the Armenian, they opened a new museum, a new small museum in Jerusalem, which we're visiting, but it was very difficult to get materials. You can see here one of the examples, and he did this for, in order to get money for the Patriarch, in order to encourage Armenian pilgrimage. One of the interesting stories where I was able to find some material, it was actually from the National Library, because these are Jewish converters to Christianity, but there was a Jewish Orthodox guy from Jerusalem who tried to defame them, and he published a book and planned the second book with the photos of these Jewish who dared to convert to Christianity. And it's interesting, you can see down here, all the photographs were taken in the Armenian studio. We don't know who was the photographer, except this one, which is maybe the most important first local photographer, Garbed Karikorian. which you can see him here, and he was appointed as the official Prussian photographer, and he photographed the visit of William II. You can see here his studio, and this is most of the studios at that time were on Jaffa Road, leading towards Jaffa Gate. And here we had the studio. This is the first commercial studio, beautiful photos, and it's very interesting because all kind Jewish, Arabs, Christian, tourists were all taken. Their photograph were taken in the studio. You know, it was a unique event to go to the studio, and as it was common, and I think it's hint also the atmosphere. Many times people dress as this Orientalist dress. This is not clear if it's a man or if it's a woman, probably a woman. But usually the women were photographed, carrying jars of water and that, and the men with swords and guns, Bedouin guns. You can see here like a Jewish family and a Russian Orthodox monk and nun. Two girls, usually wedding photos, but and it was cabinet, so it's published on a cabinet. It's a really nice item. You can see here like the sizes, different sizes. This is a Yemenite family from Jerusalem, and it's very interesting because in the collection, in this private collection, there are several photos which you can see each year another child, and so each time they had a child, they came to be photographed. Here it's like for the exhibition, I kind of made a special book which I called Studio Orient with about 20 photos of Kari Korian. He was very important and the first commercial photographer. I'm coming to a more, I see that I'm running out of time, so more controversial issue, and this is Khalil Raad, the first Arabic Palestinian. He was born in Beirut. You can see also his studio. I will jump on it, sorry. Yeah, so yeah. I'm jumping to him because I want to skip first the American colony. Yeah, Khalil Raad and the Palestinian photography, because this is a very current issue, which I have something to say about it, but it's like now a big thing. You can see here also the first Palestinian photographer, Karima Aboud, and even you can see that Google made a special, on her birthday, they made a special icon. And the whole internet is full, and this is a political thing. I mean, in terms of, the question about the Orientalist photography and the Zionist photography, like the Palestinian photographer were photographing more the local Arabic Palestinian community. And this was, of course, it was in contrast of the Zionist slogan, a land without a people to people without a land. And it was also in contrast to the Orientalist photography, which was, let's say, focused on Christian research and adventurous photograph, and not so much on the local one. So, and this is true, Khalil Raad and Karima Aboud give us more photos of, let's say, the local life, the Arabic local life that were in Palestine before the Zionism arrived. So, of course, it's a big debate. It leads to a lot of, let's say, problematic things. For example, like Karima Aboud, there is a lot of photographs are now faked on her name in the internet, and some even, for example, some people call her the first that she had the stamp, the lady photographer, which of course there is nothing like this. You see this guy here, Buki Boaz, he's the biggest private collector of photography in Israel, and it's always great to work with him. And he's collecting very, let's say, extensively Khalil Raad and Karima Aboud photographer. You can see here how it was working. Like this is the Samaritans, but you see that Khalil Raad also took photos of the Western Wall. He had a catalog, like you could order photo number 35, and then you would from the catalog, and you could find you get this lantern. You made a lot of copies, and you could take it back to your village or city in Europe and screen it by the magic, magic torch, like screening it to in your church or in the school. It was very popular. All the photographers did it, and he collects very extensively Khalil Raed. And the problem, I would say, that why not to consider the Armenian the first local photographer or the first Palestinian photographer, for example, local Palestinian, like they were not Jews, they were. Why Khalil Raed? Khalil Raed was a Christian Arab. Karim Abud was also a Christian Arab. So it's all very, let's say, as usually in Israel, and I'm not saying my opinion, but I'm saying that, as you can understand, everything is political. So even about who were the photographer. So it's much more complicated. I'm not sure, for example, Khalil, all the photographers had to work to make a living. So he also applied to the Zionist authority to why they don't give him work. And they got some work. So it's much more complicated. On the other hand, as I said, they gave us the opportunity to see photos that the Zionist photographer didn't take, and also the Orientalist photographer didn't take. It's like more the Arabic villages, the daily life in the Arabic community. You can see some of his photos here, which are really beautiful. He was a very prominent photographer, and his work appears in a lot of books. But you see a photo of Jews in the Old City. You can see he photographed Allenby Declaration in the Tower of David. But I mean, these kind of photos, a bread seller in Jerusalem. And so in the exhibition, I put only this local life, daily life in Jerusalem. I'm jumping later, and this has a very strong connection to that the real photographer who start to have a Palestinian photographer who start to have a political awareness was Ali Zarour, which is like the this guy here, which was really the first Arabic photographer, and they identified with the Palestinian struggle against Zionism. And the second one is Khalil Rissas, which I don't have a photo of him, but we have only the stamp, and it's very difficult to get his material. And this is very clear, both of them, their archives or their studio were looted or were taken by Israeli in the 48, and also some in 67 were taken by Israeli soldier or other people, as because the studio was abandoned, and then somebody took all the materials. With Ali Zarour, it's a very nice story because the IDF archive gave back to his family all his materials, but many of their material were lost. We had some in press because they were press photographers, so we had some were published all over the world. You can see, I'm jumping here, but this kind of this conflict photography, and we don't have so many photographs from the Arab side. Of course, we have much more from the Jewish side because the Jewish photographers were all very much obligate to help at that time, like the Haganah or the Jewish forces, and later in 48 the IDF. But it's very beautiful. You could see here the very famous, well-known photographer of John Phillips of how the Jordanian took over old Jerusalem. But the other photographer was which were able to join the Jordan Legion was Ali Zarour, and he takes this Churva synagogue ruins or this kind of other photos. This is a very clear example because, as you can see, it's like a stage photo. We are going to, it's really, you can see it very clearly that it's stage photo. It's not a real battle photograph. Yeah, I'm jumping. I skipped the American colony because they're very well known and their material are available in the Library of Congress, which is also a problem because it's such a free access that many exhibitions are done only by their photos, by what is called Metzon collection. If I will have time, I will come back to it. So the other chapter is between tradition and change, and this I give two examples. As I said, you can see here, Tzadok Bassan. He was an Orthodox Jew. and this is Yaakov Bendov, the father of one of the most prominent photographer and cultural, and the father of cinema in Israel, which, as I said, he wrote that every photo should serve the National Zionist mission. So Tzadok Bassan, because he was Orthodox, was actually photographing for his living. He was photographing, as you can see on the left, the rabbis, the ultra-Orthodox institution, in order to send these photos to the donors in the United States or in Europe. And this is amazing because he left us a great archive of photos that nobody else would photograph. You know, yeshiva guys learning to make to tailor, cheder in Jerusalem, because I mean this was not the subject of the secular Zionist photographer, and luckily after he died, he closed his studio in '48. The Zionist archive got, maybe ironically, but the Zionist archive got all his material, 1,000 glass negatives, and they keep them. You can see here, let's say the difference. Like here, these orphanage girls, dressed as Hanukkah, staged as Chanukiah. It was taken in Hanukkah, like the Jewish light a festival, and the day of Herzl, which was done in Betzalel, the art school, which was the most Jewish Zionist project in Jerusalem. This is another photographer. We don't know much about him, but Yud Sinai, which photographed probably the first Jewish football team in Jerusalem. And it's very rare because you can see they still wear the Turkish turban. Still before the First World War. And this is also the change of, as I said, of Jerusalem is changing. Important fact that many people are not aware of that Jerusalem from the late 60s, 1860s, they had already the Jewish majority. And this has, because the Ottoman Empire was a bit collapsing, and there were a lot of foreign consulates they had that you could live in Jerusalem, but be under the Austrian or the German or the American consulate. You can see that, and this is a very good example. Tzadok Bassan photographed this amazing rabbi, one of his the Kabbalistic rabbi. On the other hand, Yaakov Bendov photographed his daughter as Ruth the Moabit, but it's kind of connecting to the Bible from the Zionist approach. And here you can see that this was a very well kind of this. She's a Bedouin girl, but probably she's not a Bedouin. She's it's by Shlomo Narinsky. Yeah, so I will go. You can see this is beautifully. He used very nice the black and white and colors, but mainly he photographed the Orthodox religious institution and rabbis. And for example, Yaakov Bendov photographed Betzalel, like the Yemenite, or like let's say the Betzalel metalwork department, which was kind of trying to give profession to the Jewish population, mostly from at that time from Sephardic family, or Jabotinsky, or here you can see Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, Rachel Yanaid Ben Tzvi, visiting the king's tombs in Jerusalem, kind of disconnecting to the mother. The first woman photographer said it's very interesting, Rivka Karp, who immigrated from Poland, and Lou Lander was also probably the first one to teach photography in Jerusalem. But as I said before, most of them photographed in the studio. Like they photographed children, family, people, like didn't go so much outside to photograph. It took some time. A change came when when a lot of photographers escaped Germany, and this was a big change. And this, by the way, this is the National Library collection of Aliza Holtz, probably a portrait, very important portrait photographer who photographed all the prominent personalities in Jerusalem, in Rehavia, all the intellectuals. Another fact that a lot of the local studio, and this is a kind of maybe the most important local studio in Jerusalem, Photo Prisma, Hannah and Ephraim Dgani, which both again escaped Germany, and a lot of women photographers worked in their studio. So one of the facts that, it was a business. So usually all the men was going to photograph outside and the women were working in the laboratory or taking the portraits in the local studio. So it's not always clear who took which photos, but it was kind of a joint family aspect. So I show some examples. Rivka Karp, which is considered to be the first Jewish photographer in Israel. It's a very interesting family. Now it's very well known in Poland. It's a big issue, the Karp family, because her sister Esther Karp became a painter and a very kind of avant-garde movement. So there is quite a lot of interest now in Poland in the Karp family, and also in Israel. But you can see all these kind of very staged, very classical family photograph. Aliza Holtz, it's very interesting. She had this collection in the National Library with these beautifully portraits of women, much better the photograph than her men that she photographed. And some of them might be even from Berlin, when she already started to work as a photographer in Berlin, and she escaped Germany. You could see here, all this is from the National Library archive, but you see this. So it's not clear from, this looks very strange that it was taken in Palestine, but might be, I don't know. But this is very clearly from Palestine at that time, from the 30s or 40s. I will jump Bettina Oppenheimer, which is completely forgotten, but very important because she was probably the first photography artist, much ahead of her time, also from the men, and she used this experimental photography. As you can see, photogram, color photograph. She painted on negative, and it's a very unique story. She's completely forgotten. And I thought that this is a good opportunity to give her the credit she deserves, and maybe she's the first one to have an exhibition of photography, but because at that time, photography was not considered as an art. You didn't exhibit a photography as art. Sometimes they use it, but as an art exhibition, and her exhibitions were the first one. The last chapter, and I see that I'm running out of time. I'll just give you two examples. This is a great work of Moti Mizrahi, King of Jerusalem, full of the hill. This kind of ambivalent, criticizing, asking question approach. And as you can see, this is not a photograph. It's art act, but it was photographed, and he did it when he was student, like sitting as watching Jerusalem, and am I the king of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem is just full of the hill? So as I said, at that time in the early 70s, this were the time when photography started to be considered as an art. The first photography curator in Israel were appointed in the late 70s, first in the Israeli Museum in 78, I think, and also Tel Aviv Museum. It took time much later than United States. So I thought to close this chapter in the fact that when people start to ask questions and to be more critical, another very famous project, which was very considered to be, like, let's say, the most important art act performance in Jerusalem. It's Yoshua Neushen, very famous Israeli photographer who is now living in the United States, which made the Jerusalem River project and put some kind of sound of a river, also with relevance to the prophets and very complicated issue, but from a monastery in Abu Tur in Jerusalem toward the desert. As you can see some of his photo here. And Moti Mizrahi, one of iconic work, where he is a cripple from childhood, and he walked as Jesus, but with a self-portrait, like a selfie on his back in the Via Dolorosa station. And the only thing which remained were the photograph, and it's very funny because it's iconic work. It's in many museums, but I was searching for, because I need a good scan, so I was searching for the original film. And then I found eventually the film, which he didn't remember exactly who took the photos, and he was another fellow student, and some of the frames were exposed so badly, you know. So it was like this iconic work. You find some very poor negative as the base of that. The last part, which I did, which was very difficult selection, it's what's like, let's say, photographing Jerusalem history, like, let's say, some of the iconic photos of Jerusalem. It's, you know, of course, as always in exhibition, you have a limited space, so it was a very difficult challenge, a very demanding challenge to select what is actually the photos. So again, these two photos that I showed before, but for example, the famous story of Jerusalem surrounded to the British, which actually each officer moved the surrounding to another one. There was an exhibition, Allenby, in Jerusalem, and I did the catalog of that. So it's a very interesting story. You know, the King David Hotel, the Arab Revolt in '36, the famous photograph of Robert Capa, which visited, you know, the most important photojournalist, the Burma Road, and David Rubinger, you should know, is the declaration of the UN resolution and so on. The surrounded of the old city in the 48 war, the Jews are going out. On the other hand, King Abdallah visiting after the victory, visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is a great photo of King Hussein young King Hussein flying over the Temple Mount. And this is kind of, when we are speaking about the Jordanian connection to the Temple Mount, this is actually, you can see it already, at least this ambitious issue already in this photo, how he looks from the Temple Mount, which he was the first one to cover it with kind of gold. The Eichmann trial, and the first, very important, most well-known photograph of the David Rubinger, the paratroopers in the '67 war. So all this kind of, this is closing the exhibition, like the kind of the iconic photo. The Black Panthers, the burning of the 69, there was this attempt to burn the Al-Aqsa Mosque by a Christian fundamentalist from Australia. And maybe just to go back to one thing that now very much current very much relevant in Israel, it's the question of, you know, army and Orthodox. And this is by the famous, I didn't speak about it, maybe the most important Israeli photographer, or one of the most important photojournalists in general, Tim Nahum Gidal, which also escaped Germany, but became maybe at least at that time, the most prominent world photographer that, from Palestine, Israel. And he has a very unique eye. Like each photo is kind of a story, and this kind of in the 48 war of just period of that training of Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem. So thank you very much. And you know, I'm sure, or maybe there are some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shimon, for this really great and interesting presentation. And yes, actually, we do have a few questions. So first of all, Alessandra is asking how these old photographs have been preserved over the years.
Yeah, so some of them, I would divide it to two aspects, like the negatives or the daguerreotype or other material, which of course it's much more difficult to find. But it's a very good question, because one of the reasons that each institution actually, or many research and libraries has a good collection, is because these photographs were printed as books or in travel books. Like each photographer or many photographer, it was kind of a trend, you know. I'm publishing my diary of visit, my visit diary in the Middle East, and it was published as a book. And in the beginning, they could not printed on the book, so they used to glue it on the book. So you see in a lot of collections, just people were taking out the page from the book page and keeping aside the photos. But you know, books were published in more copies, so it's less rare. And you know, libraries scanned later on the scan. Many of the sources are from the printed materials that are in the books. Institutions scan them. You know, some photographer you cannot find. It's very difficult to find. For example, as I said, there are the Palestinian Arabic photographer. Most of their archive were destroyed, disappeared, and this is why people are collecting it very much. There was also, for example, this Lou Landau, a very important woman photographer. You know, she left the United States and it just took out all her thousands of glass negative, put it near the garbage, and it was thrown to the garbage. So it's question of luck. It's a very good point, because one of the problem of researcher, and I think it's also relevant to other fields, it's actually research what is left, not what you cannot find. So might be other, like this sign, Yud Sinai, which this amazing photograph of this football team. There are only 2 photos of him, or 2 or 3 photos in the whole archive that I know. You know, photographer had to. Today it's very difficult to be a photographer, but at that time it also was very difficult to be a photographer, to make a living. So people were photographing for a few years and then trying to find a better job. And some of them were, the clever one donated their photograph to the archive. Yaakov Ben-Dov, for example, gave a lot to the Zionist Archive, to the Israeli Museum, preserved some important photographer.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, another question from Alina. Will any original prints will be exhibited in the new museum?
This is a very good question. Because it's a permanent exhibition, so of course we cannot display, because you know, permanent exhibition is for the next 30 years. So there is not original prints, but this is not exactly true, because there is some parts which will so there is no original prints, but you know, many other exhibition we exhibit the original print. If it would be for 1 year or half a year, we would do it, but because it's a permanent exhibition, you don't do it. If you will see here, I will jump quickly. This is beautifully you can see here, for example, I made original, really, and it was a big challenge to the studio that you did it. For example, we did the original of the American colony slides, which they used to be painted by hand. So we did a copy, but it's just because it's a permanent exhibition, so you cannot display original. There are some parts that there will be for only 1 year, and then I will change it. So there are, but this is not the. And you know, the some of the late photograph, it's digital print from original print. So it's like here also I made copies of the original exactly the same. So I hope it answers your question, Alina.
Lovely. Okay, very interesting question from Robert Bell. First of all, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. And the question. Given the number of people passing through the area over the years with cameras, there must be a lot of unseen photos. What would be the potential photo setting you would recommend? You would like to find?
What I would like to find?
Yeah, as a potential photo settings of those unseen photos.
Yeah, I think we have a big, especially as Israeli, but I think in general, we have a big shortage with photography and good photographer when East Jerusalem was under the Jordanian rule. So this is something I would like to really to expand the possible. There is also political. The Jordanians not always are cooperating in this respect, but also the status of East Jerusalem was less, like the Jordanians put less effort or less importance to Jerusalem. It's very well known than Western Jerusalem. So there are less photos. You know, this is an endless search. There is a big one another, and I'm speaking openly, one of the biggest problem that the woman photographer, so Aliza Holtz and Rivka Karp, and I hope I'm not making angry anyone here, but this is the truth. Their archive is in the municipality archive of Jerusalem, and it's unbelievable, but you don't have access to their for this. It's a scandal, and it's for this photography archive. Especially this. One of my dreams is to make an exhibition about the first woman photographer of Jerusalem. There is a whole lot very interesting, and so I was able to get some material from private collectors, from private families, and things like that. But nobody really researched this body of work, which is in the Jerusalem municipality. I'm not the only one who's suffering from this problematic. And this study, you can see how we appreciate the National Library because this is blocked. So this is a huge problem. I think also to find more of the Palestinian side or some less known photographer, this would be also important.
Great. Okay, actually, another question is kind of a prolongation of what you just said. Could you say something about archives of official Ottoman photography? Gregor Szkła.
Yeah. So there is when I was working on the Temple Mount, I employed a researcher in Istanbul to search for me, and we got some materials. But surprisingly, a lot of the collection were well-known photographs that I knew from other sources. So I would not say that it's I'm sure there is more to find. I mean, I don't deny it, but it's not that. Maybe I didn't say it, but of course you can say. Of course, when the British came, I mean, the photography emerged much more. I mean, the British used it as for mapping, for building, for social life, and also it's evolved alongside the development of photography. The cameras became smaller. There were negatives. You know, the Leica, which from the 20, the Leica, the famous Leica camera, made a big change because you could photograph from different angles and so on. So I think there is a gap between the. I mean, it's important, but it's not something what I would put the Ottoman photography. It's under the Orientalist more or less. As I said, the changing point was the visiting of William the Caesar, and this was the late, let's say, not collapsing, but the end of the Ottoman Empire. But it's true that at that time already the Ottomans tried to bring modernity as well and started to understand the importance of Jerusalem and to make it a bit modern, but in some respects it was too late. I hope I answer, but it's not, I search, not me personally, but we search the Ottoman Empire, and I know this archive also in the internet, and I always look on them, but it's not something that you can say it's a whole new field.
Yes. Okay, and the last question, what is the web page of your catalogs? I mean, if you use any catalogs, and do you have any collected website, or what we'll see at the website?
No, I don't have a web. Sorry, I don't have a website, but there is. I have you know, in this academia page website. So you just click Shimon Lev. Yeah. Okay. You would just click Shimon Lev, and you know there are different academic papers, but there are these two catalogs of the photographer and the Temple Mount, and I can I'm really happy always that I see that people downloading it from Arabic countries, from all over the world. This is really great.
I'm looking for this website, and I will send it.
You know, Academia Edu. You know, I can. So you see this Shimon Lev as my name.
Sure. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming this evening or afternoon for those in the United States. Shimon, thank you very much, really, for the wonderful presentation, and good luck with a new exhibition at the Refreshed Museum.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye.